SQL has this very important feature, views. You can define views, and views are also sometimes called a virtual table. Okay, so one of the strengths of SQL is that it provides us this facility of creating views, and views can be used to define the external data model, right? So in the 3-level architecture for database, if you could remember, we have internal model, there is something called as conceptual model, or the logical versus conceptual, and on the top we have the external model. Now because of 3-level architecture, if you could remember, it becomes a lot convenient to design a database application, and we did discuss about the physical data independence, logical data independence and all. So views are very helpful in that. So what you can do, as I believe we have over here, once the view is defined, and you will see, right, we did see that in the last class, and we will look at some examples involving views. And guys, I will ask you to create some views in your exam, right? So this is all going to be important. You would very soon see that making use of this SQL statement, we can define a view. And now once the view has been defined using a SQL query, then its contents that we create, right, can be directly accessed by an application, right? So here we have a view. When it is defined by SQL query, its content is generated upon invocation. So this is something we will see today. And once you have defined a view, then your application that you have written, right, can directly interact with your view, right? So rather than making your application interact with the physical table, you can let the application interact with a view, right? So that way you can achieve what is called as logical data independence, I think, right? We will see that very soon. Good. So a view is a virtual table, right? Now the question arises, why do we call that virtual table? Because in physical table, how did we create physical table? If you remember, in this topic, initially we learned about create statements, which we use to create table. So once you create the table, you put the values in the table, then that table is stored physically on your machine, right? There is data stored there physically, really. Whereas in case of views, it is not the case, right? So what view does? A view is just like your maybe a method that you write in a program, say Java, right? So why do we write method? Well, if there is a code that you want to repeat multiple times in your program, then what you will do, you'll probably write a method for that, and wherever you want to do that computation, you will simply invoke that method. In similar way, views are invoked, right? So views, you can say, are very similar conceptually to a method that you write in a Java program. All right, so view is a virtual table. It doesn't have the physical tuples stored there like a physical table, like a real table, I'll say. So yeah, this is the important point which I mentioned maybe a few seconds back. Views allow for logical data independence, right? So what is the advantage of logical data independence? If you have written your application in such a way that your application is interacting with a view, then you have this flexibility of making some changes in the base table, and those changes will not impact your application, because your application is in fact interacting with a view. Okay, so actually views have a lot of advantages as well, which I think we don't have here, right? But maybe we can discuss few, but before that I'll make sure that I finish what all I have over here. Now one advantage, as you can see over here, is the logical data independence, which allows for three-level architecture. What can we think about the advantages, right? Do you see any advantage? We have one over here, logical data independence, right? Make your application such that they are interacting with views only. So that way you will have the flexibility of making some changes in the base tables without impacting your application. Right? That is one advantage. What could be the other advantages of view? We'll see some of those maybe in the next few slides. Yes, go ahead. So what's the first? Security, right? Very good. Security is one of the main, what I would say, advantage of a view, right? So you may call that security. At the same time, let me write all these things here so that you know it is being recorded. Security, yes, that's correct. One, can we write that as customization? Are you fine with this term, customization? Right? And customization is something that we experience in our day-to-day life, right? There's one database that we all use, like the Solar database, right? You are using Solar as a student, but I use Solar as a faculty member. So what do you think? The view of the Solar that you people see and what I see, is that going to be similar? No, right? So it all depends on the kind of user that we have. So for students, we would define a different view. For the instructors, you'll have a separate view, right? Because I want to see the students that I'm teaching. I want to know about their, major, whether these are PhD students, whether these are master students, whether these students are CS students or information science students. So all that information I will need. Therefore, the person who designed Solar has given me a different view. For student, different view, because you can register for courses, you can check your grades, you can see your transcript. I don't know what all you can see, but I can anticipate that you are looking at a different view. Now think about those people who are working in admin, right? They'll have a different view altogether, I think, right? Probably they'll have the information about your, fee and all, whether you have paid, whether you have registered, all those things. So yeah, customization, security, and then this is what? Logical data independence, right? These three advantages I can see straight away. So let's look into the ways in which we can create views, and I remember I went over some of these slides, but the remaining slides are based on this discussion. So let's look at that. Now, whenever we have to define a view, then we will use the create statement, right? And in case of creating a table, we use the keyword create table, create domain, right? So here, since we are creating a view, we'll have to write view after create. We'll say create view and then give a name to the view, right? So the name that we have given here is top suppliers. Well, it will make sense, like why are we calling this new view as top suppliers? But before that, let's see how this whole view would be defined. You have given a name, but that name is followed by the clause as, right? And after as, you will have a query for that, right? So what is this query doing? Let's look at that first, right? Because this is in fact extremely simple, and once we understand what this query is doing, then we will very easily understand what this view is all about. Okay, so pay attention to this query, which is a simple select query that selects supplier number, supplier name from the supplier table where supplier status is greater than 50. Very simple query, right? Probably this is something we would do as the very third or fourth query using select statement. Just one table involved. Now what is interesting over here is that this select query that we have written has been given a name, right? And that name is a view. That's what the view is altogether, right? So that's the reason I said that if you try to understand what view is being defined, I find that very similar to the way you will be defining a method in a program, right? Or a function in a programming language. Good. So once you understand this whole query, then this whole query has been given a name, which is top suppliers, and that top supplier is what? Is a view. So you created a view named top supplier, and how is this top supplier defined? You can use an as and then the corresponding SQL query. So believe me, if I ask, and with very high probability I will ask you to create view, should be simple. Okay, just this thing, create view, name of the view, add. followed by a simple query. Good. So fine. Now let's move on to the second example of a view. This is our first example, that's our second example. Now here we are creating another view. So we will follow the same syntax. We will say create view and has been given a different name, which is top suppliers SF for San Francisco. And for that we are saying as, it's a similar way as we had done for the definition 1. We'll say create view top supplier SF as select star from top suppliers where supplier city is San Francisco. Now one interesting thing that you would find here is that the second view is in fact defined on the previous view. Alright, so it seems to me that yeah, you can continue. There's no such rule that the view can be defined only on physical table. You can define a view even on a view as we have in this case. Does this make sense? The second case, first case simple, second case is simple too, but in the second case our view is based on an existing view. That can happen. Now let's move on and look at another view, right, that goes like this, and it's slightly complex compared to the views that we saw earlier. So here what we are doing, so we are creating a view that we are calling as order overview. Good. And in this view we have these columns called product number, product name and total quantity, right? So that's how your view would look like with these three columns: product number, product name and total quantity. Now question arises, how are we getting these values, right? So this much we should kind of remember, that create view, the name of the view, all the columns that we have, followed by the keyword as, and then the rest should be simpler. Why the rest should be simpler? Because we have done a lot of select statements, right? So what a view is just a name given to a select query. That's it. Alright, so before we connect everything to the view, let's see what is this query doing for us. Well, for this information, that is product number, product name and quantity, we would need two base tables. What are these base tables? Product is one base table and the other table is purchase order line, right? Now interestingly, in this query we are performing a left outer join. We want the information about all the products, even if they have not been purchased, or even if there is no entry for that in the purchase order line, right? We want the information about all the products. So therefore we are doing the left outer join with the product P as our left table and purchase order line, which we are calling as POL, as our right table. And this is very simple on the condition of the join, which says P dot purchase product number is equal to POL dot product number. Good. And after that we will have to do group by also. Why group by? Because one of the column that we need in our view is an aggregate column, right? Look at it. We select P dot product number, P dot product name and sum of POL dot quantity. We want the quantity of each product which has been listed in the purchase order table. Okay, and that's what it is. And since this select query has been connected to the view that we are defining, therefore it will result in a view being created with the name, order, overview with these three columns. Good, fine. Now after that, once you have to define this view, you can further write queries on this view. Okay, so after that, this thing that you have created can be used as a virtual table, right? Just like a normal table, you can write select queries on this. So as an example, if top supplier SF was your view that you had defined earlier, then you can perform select star on this view also. You will get all the tuples. But one thing we need to keep in mind is that it all depends on the implementation. We will see that very soon. In most of the cases, what will happen, whenever you are saying select star from top supplier SF, then this view that you have, right, would be replaced by the corresponding what? Select statement. Okay? So this is called view modification. What is this view modification? Don't worry about it. We will encounter this explanation, but I thought this is very simple example, so maybe we can look at it and try to understand what a view modification is. Whenever we are querying from view, which is top supplier here, then what will happen here? Whenever you say select star from top supplier SF, then this thing over here, which is the name of the view, would be replaced by what? It will be replaced by this query, all right, which is select star from top suppliers, where supplier city is San Francisco. Now interesting thing is what will happen for this guy. Even this thing will be replaced by the corresponding SQL query, right? So again, it is very similar to the way we will be making use of the methods of the function in a program. Whenever you need some computation, you invoke that method, and that method's body is replaced. Now, similar to this one, where we have written a query for a view. Similarly, you can write another query, right? So let me call it query 1, query 2. In the second query, what we are doing, we are saying select star from order overview, where product name like this thing, right? So we need to remember what this like does. Okay, so like is a clause which is used to check whether the column has that substring or not, right? So what is interesting here, we want to make sure that the product name that we have in the order overview has a substring chard, right? Same thing, right? Whatever we had tried, whatever we did in the select queries involving physical table, the same we can do on the views as well. All right, so now this is what I was explaining to you earlier. For SQL views, there are two ways of implementation. Query modification is what I explained to you. In query modification, what happens? The RDBMS modifies the queries that query a view into the queries on the underlying base table, right? So that's what I was explaining with the help of that query that involved select star on top supplier SF. So that is one way. Now query modification, guys, this could be an important concept. Okay, how is a query view? What are the possible ways in an SQL view could be implemented? So the first approach is query modification, where the SQL where the view definition is replaced by corresponding underlying base tables. How about the other approach? View materialization, right? So that is not the only option. We have another option which is called view materialization. In view materialization, what is done? A physical table is created when the view is first queried, right? So there are two possibilities. It's not always the case that we will not create a physical table corresponding to a view. Sometimes, right, let's assume the scenario where we need a view which will be fired frequently, right, very frequently. So in that case, that will be an overhead when you're replacing a view definition with the corresponding SQL statement. That will be time consuming, right? So I would assume that in order to make that more efficient, the better approach is for view materialization, where a physical table is created when the view is first queried, right? Now you should be asking so many questions, right? Like view is based on physical table, right? It is possible that your physical table is getting changed, but your view may not change. Do you see that problem, right? So with this approach of view materialization, we have an issue of synchronization. What would be synchronization? Let's assume that the view that we have, if you could remember, right, we created a view. Maybe I can take you back to that example. This one, order overview, right? We created this view, and this view is implemented using materialization. In materialization, you will be creating a physical table to store the result of this query. Now let's assume that something changed in the purchase order line, right? So say a supplier that was initially not placing any order in the purchase order line has placed an order now, right? So the base table has changed. So when the base table has changed, then the corresponding change should be brought about in what? The corresponding table which stores the result of the view. Okay, so this is called synchronization, making sure that the table that we have which represents the view is up to date. Now the question arises, like, when should we do synchronization? Should it be immediate or should it be deferred? So it all depends on how you define it, right? So the immediate synchronization will be a situation where if you are making any change to the base table, then that change should be immediately reflected on your table that is storing the view. The deferred one would be the case where you will update the table for the view only when that view is requested, right? So that makes sense too. Anyway, let's keep moving. So now I think one of you asked me this question, like, should our views updatable or not, right? So the possibility is that the view can be updatable, but we should be very, very careful about when we should not allow the view to be updated, right? Because if you are making any change to a view, then what will happen? That change will be reflecting the corresponding base tables as well. So let's see in what cases we can allow the view to be updatable and where we cannot. So some views can be updatable. We'll look at some examples where we can allow the view to be updatable and where we cannot. Now in the cases where the view is updatable, it serves as a window through which the updates can be propagated to the underlying base tables, right? So this should be simple enough. So now let's look at this view. Okay, what is this view doing? I think we have seen this view, right? Order overview, fine. Good, simple enough. Now let's see. Do you understand this view, right? What is this view doing? We just saw that, right? Order overview that has 3 parameters in there, or 3 columns: product number, product name, and total quantity. Good. And for this we are doing left outer join. The left outer join involves the 2 tables, product table and the purchase order line, right? We discussed about it. And we are doing group by, and there is this aggregate function which is sum of quantity, right? And we are properly doing it by making use of the group by and then proper join and all that. Now let's look into this update statement, right? We will learn about update, right? How do we update our table? So here we said that that view is a virtual table. So let's attempt to update the view. If the view is updatable, that's how you will do. You'll say update view, the name of the view, which is order overview, and we will set the total quantity to 10, where product number is 0154. Now let's first understand our intention. In this view, right, what we want to do, we want to set the total quantity of a product with the product number which is 0154. Okay, intention clear, right? Now tell me, is it okay? Should this work? Or is there anything that will create problems for us? let me rephrase this thing, right, and probably which I already explained. If the view is updatable, then through updatable table what will happen, we will be changing the base table. You have the answer, right? So guys, look at it. The problem here is that the total quantity field that we are trying to update, right, we want to update its value to 10, right? But how can we obtain this value 10? There are multiple ways, right? Let's assume that this is the case. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 students, right? They quiz 2, I have that with me. Let's assume that you people got your score, right? And that what I need is the average score. And I'm saying that, you know, if the average score was 18, let's change that to 17. Now the average score can be changed from 18 to 17 in a number of ways, right? Let's forget about average, just think about the total. Okay, if the total is 20, 20, 500, say 90, right? 20 multiplied by 5 is 100, right? So total maximum points possible is 100. Let's say the total of the grade that you people obtained in quiz 2 is 70, and I'm saying let's change that 70 to 80, right? So there are so many ways in which you can have the value 80, right? So for that reason, there are multiple ways in which this thing can be updated. And so for that ambiguity, there should not be any ambiguity involved, right? So here we have an ambiguity, because of which SQL will not allow this thing to happen. All right, so this view is not updatable. The DBMS will result in an error. All right, so let's look at a few more views. So guys, with views we have this option that is called with check, right? So what is the utility of this clause with check? Now let me read that and then I'll explain to you. Whenever you are defining a view the way we have here, so let's look at this. Create view top suppliers, right? So here create view top suppliers, select select supplier number, supplier name from supplier where supplier status is greater than 50. So this part we had already done in one of the definition. What we have done here is we put this thing, right, with check option. Now we need to understand what is this check option, right? Why should we put this in the view definition? So what it does, it checks for update and the insert statement, and it makes sure that these, if you are updating it, right, through the insertion or deletion, this update or insertion or deletion should not compromise with the way this view was defined, right? So let's look at some example, then probably it will make more sense. With check option, checks update and insert statement for conformity with the view definition. How is this view defined? In this view, we want the supplier name and supplier name from supplier table only for those tuples where their status is greater than 50, right? And then we just want to make sure that this definition of the view should not be compromised, and for that we are using this option with check option, right? Now let's look at it. We want to update this view, right? And how are we updating? We are saying, you know what, this view that you have defined, let's update that. And how are we updating? We'll say, okay, let's set the status to 20 for the supplier 32. Is there any problem here? Should this be allowed? Let's start with that, right? Should this be allowed? Top supplier is a view where we have supplier number as well as supplier name for those supplier whose status is greater than 50, right? You have all those records there. Now what you are doing, you are saying, okay, fine, you know, we have in this view only those suppliers whose status is greater than 50. Now from that we have a supplier number 32, we want to set its status to 20. What will happen? This update is not conforming with what? The definition of the view, right? It should not be allowed, because, you know, the very reason your supplier number 32 is there in your view because its status was greater than 50. Now you change that to 20, right? So in these kind of cases, we should make use of with check option, right? Just to make sure that the update that we are doing is conforming with the view definition. Okay, so this is not allowed, not okay. How about the second one? Does that make sense, right? How about the second one? Should the second one be allowed? Update the same query, right? Set the status to 80 where supplier number is 32, right? Makes sense? Yeah, because it will, anyway, this is greater than 50, right? So we are fine with it. Good. Now let's look at the last part of the SQL where we will look at some. Alright guys, so we have learned about a lot of SQL statements. Now we have these privileges in SQL which can be used to control the access on the table, right? So let's look at this. We know what select does, right? So you can provide the select privilege to a user. So if the select privilege is given to a user on a table, then the user can retrieve the information from the table. We can also be specific, like when you are giving a select privilege to a user, then you can specify on which columns you are granting the select, right? Similarly, you can provide the insert privilege. So if you are providing the insert privilege on some table to a user, then that user can insert values. Similarly, the update privilege, if you have given to a user, then the user can update the table. Similarly, delete works. Similarly, alter works. You have reference privilege also. Reference privilege is an interesting privilege where you can control whether a user can establish the foreign key relationship with a table, right? So which is very interesting actually. So whether you are allowing a user to enforce the to use or to define the referential integrity constraint. And for referential integrity constraint, you know what it is, right? A foreign key is accessing the primary key of the referred table. And you can also provide the all privileges, right? The user can perform all the queries on the table. So let's look at some examples here. Here we have the user named B. Basils. That's one of the author of the textbook. So you are granting, right? So what you have to learn, you need to learn about the grant and revoke. With grant, you provide the privileges to a user for some operations. Like in this first query, let's see, when you say grant select, insert, update, delete on supplier table to B basis, then that means to this user, you are allowing this user to perform select, insert, update and delete on that specific table, which is supplier. All right. Now, in the second statement, it's even more interesting where you are granting the select on the product number and product name columns only of the table product to public. Public means there's a class of user, right? So for public users, category of public users, you are allowing those users to select, that means retrieve the information from these two columns. Good. Let's look at the third statement. You are revoking, right, the delete on supplier from B basis, right? So this is connected with the first statement. In the first statement, you gave the select, insert, update, delete on supplier to this user. But in the third statement, you are revoking that privilege, which is the delete privilege that you had earlier granted on statement number 1, right? Now the fourth one is probably the most interesting one. Let's see how is this privilege being defined or provided. You are granting the select, insert, update and delete on product to a user, right? Let's call that W because this name is very difficult, with grant option. What So guys, this may be the most interesting or maybe the most important question if I ask anything on the grant, right? Grant, select, insert, update, delete on that table product to the user W with grant option. Yeah, an instructor is granting an instructor permission to a TA, right? So that kind of a situation where let's assume that only instructor can change the grade of a student, right? Changing the grade. I'm just trying to come up with a real life example. Now the TS may be given the privilege just to teach for a lecture, right? If I'm not well on a certain day, I'll ask the TA, okay, fine, here you go. I'm giving you the grant to teach. But if I give all the other grant also with grant option, then that the TA on that day can also change the grade. Anyway, back to this one, right? Probably here it is making a lot of sense. So once you grant the select, insert, update, delete on the product table to this user with the grant option, then the user that we have here can further propagate or pass on these privileges to other users, right? All right, so now the last one, in the last statement here, we are granting the references privilege on supplier to this user. Let's call that user S. So what will happen after this grant? User S can make use of the table supplier for establishing the integrity constraint, right? It can access a table, a column, and use that as the foreign key. So now let's look at some examples. So here we are creating a view, suppliers New York, and that view is defined as select supplier number, supplier name from suppliers, where supplier city is New York, right? Simple enough. After that, what you can do, once the view has been defined, you can grant the select on supplier New York to a user W, right? So interestingly, what has happened, you are not only creating a view, you are giving a grant to the view also. So in a way, in these two examples or the queries, query 1 and query 2. In query 1, you define a view, and in query 2, you give the privilege on that view to a user, right? So in a way, it's a very simple example that can give you some idea about customization of the database. Customization as well as security. All right, questions? All right, guys, with this, that's all we did in this topic, where we looked at the SQL, started with data definition language statements, create statements and all that. Then we spent good time looking at the select statement, insert statements and all that. Then we learned about views, and finally we did SQL privileges. Okay.